All right, everyone, good morning and welcome to our webinar on neurodiversity with our amazing Fairfax County Public Schools neurodiversity specialist, Kristen Haynor. We're so thrilled to have Kristen with us, and this is one in a four-part series that we will be doing over the next few months, and so we hope that you will join us again. But I'm going to turn this over to Kristen. Kristen, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth, to you for your partnership in this and your collaboration around this neurodiversity work, and for your whole team for all that they're doing behind the scenes, and Lisa's gorgeous flyers. This wouldn't be possible without you guys, so thank you for your support. Let's get started. As Mary Beth said, I'm Kristen, and as we get started, I wanted to give just a little bit of a background on myself so you can get to know me more and how I came to this work. So my educational background is in biology, special education, and educational leadership, and I'm now working on my PhD with one of my focal points being neurodiversity in public education systems. So as Mary Beth said, I am the neurodiversity specialist on the equity and cultural responsiveness team in the Office of Professional Learning and Equity. So this is a brand new position to Fairfax County Public Schools. I started in May of last year. And so to give you an overview of what this role entails, I've got 3 buckets for you. One is to cultivate understanding and inclusive mindsets and practices that honor the neurodiversity in all of our educational spaces, as well as having a focus on neurodivergent individuals, both adults and students, to facilitate and engage others to critically reflect on strength-based mindsets and therefore language and communication between our neurodivergent and our neurotypical communities to create belonging and access, and also to support neurodiversity affirming practices in all of our educational spaces, while also focusing on our students receiving special services and specialized instruction. So it's through collaboration and partnering with our Fairfax County Public School offices, our schools, our community spaces, organizations. SEPTA has been incredible, as well as ASCD, and supporting our policy work as well. Before I forget, I know that we have a chat feature and I will be checking it periodically, but also thank you to Mary Beth, who will be monitoring that for me. So I will be able to go back and make sure that I read all comments and perspectives. So I also want to start our time together this morning by naming 3 things up front. One, sharing that I am a neurodiversity expert, and I am not an expert in all things neurodiversity. As many of you know, in this virtual room, or as many of you will learn as you're starting your journey on this to learn more about this work, it is incredibly vast and ever evolving, which on the one hand is very exciting that this field and this knowledge is expanding. And on the other hand, it includes many perspectives and approaches that as we are continuing to learn more about. So with that being said, too, I want to position myself as a learner and a partner in this with Fairfax County Public Schools and our families. And again, there's likely a lot of expertise in this room that I want to honor and encourage your participation in the chat to support this work. And for those of you that have questions, to either pose those questions, or we will have time at the end for some Q&A. I'm constantly learning, not only from literature, research articles, podcasts, and other platforms, but most importantly, from the lived experiences of our students and staff and community members. So while I am unable in this role to individually support cases, as there is only one of me, I am always interested in looking for ways to listen and amplify your experiences in Fairfax County if you are willing and able to share those with me. And lastly, before I get started, I do want to also acknowledge and name that many families and staff members that are here this morning have had or may be currently having harmful experiences in their neurodivergent students' educational journey, as well as our staff members. And I just thought it was really important to put that in this space, as we are hoping through this work and through these conversations to positively transform these experiences. So thank you for letting me ground us with that. You will be receiving this resource. I'm calling it a session guide. It has working definitions that we will be using throughout our time together this morning, as well as visuals and a mindset tool for you to use as soon as we leave from here. So I appreciate Mary Beth. We're going to be sending that out afterwards. And I also want to share that I specifically wanted to name that these are working definitions, as I might be continuing to repeat throughout our time together. There is no single definition for each of these terms. So I'm going to be presenting the most updated definitions based off of research and literature and perspectives. So these are our outcomes for our time together in this webinar. And so my hope, I did receive the written requests or the input from participants about what you would like to get out of this session together. And I did my best to incorporate and address as many of those as possible to weave and fit it in with this introductory webinar. And definitely was not able to get to all of them. So I'm hopeful as we continue these series that hopefully your needs and our conversations, that hopefully your needs will be met. So just as working agreements for a webinar, again, would love to encourage your participation in the chat, and just wanted to put out there to challenge our assumptions. A lot of the work that we're going to be doing is challenging our assumptions and sharing these diverse perspectives and honoring where everybody is in this journey. I heard this quote recently that I found that I thought would really resonate for this session. And it's, if you make something unspeakable, you can't do anything about it. And so I just wanted to frame that I'm going to be sharing some information in hopes that it starts conversations. So I do want to gauge the space. In the chat, if you could write the number that reflects your experience with the term neurodiversity. 1 being, this is the very first time I'm interacting with this term, which includes neurodivergent, neurotypical, all the way to 4. I'm very well versed, whether professionally or through personal experience, just to get an idea of what we have. Yes. Okay, as I'm scrolling through, I'm seeing a little bit of everything, which is awesome. Okay, great. So want to encourage you to, again, ask those questions and provide perspectives, as we are all experts in different ways in this area. So I'm going to start us off with a scenario, and we will come back to this before we end today. So I wanted to give a home example. And so you have asked your child, your cousin, your goddaughter, you have asked your child to unload the dishwasher 3 times in the last 20 minutes and find them still sitting on the couch watching TV. What might be your initial reactions or thinking? What might be going on in your head? And again, this is just initial. What might be some initial thoughts? And if you could just put those in the chat, I would love to see what you write. This is non-judgmental. This is just what might come to mind when you approach the situation, or your perceptions of this individual. Maybe expectations too high. She's ignoring me. Yeah, distracted by something else. Ooh, I need help breaking down the scale. Not listening or ignoring. Oh, wow, these are good. They're coming in. Stubborn, ignoring, hyper-focused, engrossed. What the heck? Yeah, my mom said that many times. Disappointed. Ooh, a warning. Good. Time blindness. These are all so good. Frustrated, angry. They're not a, yeah, absolutely. Fourth time ask. Oh, these are good. 20 times. Processing delay. Fourth time. Tuning out. Yes. Fantastic. Angry. Yes. We have a plethora of reactions, and I want us to hold on to those, and hopefully you've had the time to scroll through those in the chat as well, because we will be coming back to them. And thank you for your input there. So I'm going to build us up to a definition and an understanding of neurodiversity. And so to do that and scaffold our way up, we're going to start with the definition of diversity. And so diversity, meaning the variety of, I apologize, I woke up with something, I'm fine, but I've got lots of liquids here to help. So the variety of, which entails different identities that include gender, sexual orientation, race, all of these social constructs as they relate to identity, and naming that there is no one right category or correct category. There's no one right or correct identity or way of being. So to put this visually, here we have an individual with all of those constructs of identity that might make up the diversity of an individual. And so you'll notice that the arrows going from the individual to those identities are a double-ended arrow. And that's intentional because as someone engages in new experiences, those identities are likely going to change over time. They're fluid, they are ever evolving. And we have what's called avowed identities, which is how does this individual identify themselves? What do they believe who they are? Who are they according to them? And then we also have ascribed identities, which is if I were to be looking at this individual, how do I identify them based off of my perception of their identities? And does that align with who they are? Also, we need to layer in what is the context in which this person is operating, because sometimes in one place and time, identities might look one way, and another place and time, identities might look a different way. So hold on to this thinking as we go into some brain learning light. And I really am emphasizing light here because one of the major ways in which we are defined and how our different identities and experience shape us is through our brain wiring. And so our brain is far from a simple structure. It's likely many of you in this virtual room today have expertise in this area, but as a general introduction, I'm going to go over very generalized concepts just to give some contextual knowledge. I also want to put out a disclaimer that I am not a medical professional. I am not a clinical psychologist or any of those licensures. This is all through academic research and learning that I wanted to present this to you in this way. So here we have a neuron. Neurons are the fundamental units of our nervous system. And this is as you can see, a clip art version of a neuron. And there's for different neurons with different functions, they have different shapes, but this is the general shape of a neuron often. And These cells are responsible for receiving sensory input from our external world. So when I touch my laptop here, it's a little slick and kind of a little grindy, which actually that's a really weird way to describe it. But they are responsible for sending signals to move muscles, for transforming and relaying information inside my processing brain, from learning to observing to memory. And each human has anywhere from 80 to 100 billion neurons. So with all those neurons, they come together and they create these networks. And so one way that we can think of these networks as interstates or highways of the brain. And so what's really cool about our neural networks is that not only do our experiences shape the blueprint of that wiring, how are those highways set up and structured, but our identities, such as our all of those different identities that we saw before, race, gender, they all influence our experiences and the unique way in which you're wired. So when we engage in a new skill or a new experience, when we engage in a new skill that has multimodal practice, meaning it involves more than one sense, we can create new connections. So if you watch, boop, we've created a new connection in our neural network. And you may have heard the term growth mindset or neuroplasticity. Plasticity, thinking of when we heat up plastic, we can mold it and bend it. That's where neuroplasticity comes from. But we can build new connections. And so the importance of this is that, just to connect it back to real world application, whether in our communities or in the classroom, when we activate prior knowledge, what we already know based off of those networks, we can build these new connections. And the more and more that you practice it, it strengthens. So instead of when it initially connects, try it one time, maybe it's a dirt road, kind of going back to our travel analogy. The more and more that you practice it, the stronger that it gets. So then it becomes a concrete off-ramp. And why that's important is that you'll notice when you go back to do that skill, because that new connection is strengthened, you can do it with automaticity. You don't even really think about it anymore because you've already created and strengthened that connection. This is where you might have heard the term, those that wire together, fire together. Wait, back way. Those that fire together, wire together. And what's also important about this is that this is where use it or lose it comes from. Because if you don't engage in that productive struggle or that multiple opportunities, your brain is expending so much energy at one time that it's thinking, if you're not going to use this, boop, I'm going to cut it right off because I don't want to expend energy where I don't need to. So why this is important, just to kind of paraphrase, is that we can think of our neural networks of the blueprints of who you are through your genetic makeup and your experiences. It's your roadmap. It's why you are unique. And what's important to think about is that through repeated opportunities for practice or application, multimodal instruction, real world application, connecting to prior knowledge, these are all high leverage best practices for instruction. We can build new skills in learning. So I want to give an example. When I was teaching biology, I would give vocabulary one day, and the next day would come back and I would become so frustrated because I didn't understand why students couldn't. We went over this last class, and then I realized that I wasn't engaging them in any way in this terminology or applying those practices that I just mentioned. I wasn't building new connections. And it also kind of, then I started to realize, was I building a mindset therefore in my kids about why they couldn't, thinking I can't do it? It wasn't that they couldn't do it. It was that I wasn't providing them with the opportunities and environment to do it. So I'm so glad I started a timer because I can just get excited and talking. So with these highways that we have, if we think about these neural networks as highways, ways in which information is communicated or ways in which that we process are through electrical impulses. So we can think of these as like the cars on that highway system transporting information. Where are they driving? And we can also think of them as chemical signals. You might have heard them as neurochemicals or neurotransmitters. And so these are like the ferries, and by ferries, I mean boats, traveling from one port to the next. So you'll see them traveling between those open spaces, between those neurons. Some examples you might be familiar with are dopamine or serotonin. So let's bring it all together. All of what we just talked about is really getting at cognition, the mental action or process of acquiring information and understanding that information and expression. So if we use the prefix neuro as a synonym for cognition, that's what I want us to hold on to. And other ways of looking at cognition visually, you can see in this graphic here, it could be learning, it could be perception, thought, attention. So if we use the prefix neuro as a synonym for this cognitive process, let's put it together. So on the one hand, we have diversity, the variety of, and on the other hand, we have neuro, cognition or ways of thinking and processing. So when we put them together, we get neurodiversity. And so neurodiversity is the infinite amount variations in ways that human beings think and process information. And so a little bit later, I'm going to unpack some different ways that the term neurodiverse is used. But one way that it's used is that all humans are neurodiverse, that each one of us has a brain that is as unique as our thumbprint, because no one will ever have the same experiences, identities, therefore ways of thinking and approaching situations. And so neurodiversity is a biological fact, and it is also a perspective that there is, and a belief that there is no universal normal or right way of neurocognitive functioning, thinking, processing. So just like there's no one correct identity as a cultural construct, this terminology is how we can remove a value-laden system that is often attached to the way that people operate. Again, to say that there is no one right way of thinking, and then it's a neutral term. So neurodiversity has always existed. It's just now that we have language to talk about these different ways of thinking and the strengths that and abilities that each person has. And you'll see Judy Singer referenced several times here. She is a social scientist from the autism community who has coined this term. I want us to hold on to this quote as we move into our next section. We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. So here's a visual representation of neurodiversity. We can see every single person has their own way of thinking as represented by a different colored brain. And so this morning, I didn't share this at last night's webinar because I just couldn't stop thinking about, I feel like there's a different way that I can give context to this. So this morning, I thought of the movie Inside Out. For those of you who have not yet seen it, highly recommend it. It's a Pixar movie. But I thought it was a great representation, and to give context to what happened in the movie, there was a mom and a dad, very stereotypical roles, but in the same exact situation, they gave insight into their command centers. And so this is insight into one person's command center that is responding and processing a situation one way, the actual way, that operating system, versus the other individual who has a completely different group of little characters and how they are interpreting the situation and responding. And often gives us insight into why there are so many instances of miscommunication, because going back to that quote, we perceive as we are. So oftentimes there's a perception that you have the same set of characters as I do, when in reality, we have our own set of that room. So the brilliance and advantages of neurodiversity can only be experienced when we affirm, appreciate, and foster each individual's abilities and ways of thinking. So I know that was a very quick overview of neurodiversity. And now I want us to move into two subcategories within neurodiversity of neurotypical and neurodivergent. So these two ways of operating fall under neurodiversity. So this term neurotypical is created from the neurodiversity community as a way to talk about and discuss a way of operating. One way of defining it is that there are no identified neurological conditions that the brain has developed in a way that is typical. It is also a term that's used to be able to talk about a way of operating that does not associate, that removes this power and privilege without reinforcing that power and privilege. So it makes us, what did I want to say here? I'm so sorry. I just had a glitch. Going back to, it makes us being able to use this term while removing this falsehood of a, as we talked about before, a universal, normal, or correct way of operating. There is no correct way of operating. This is just a term that we can use to talk about an individual who has developed in a typical way without referring as normal. We're removing normal completely because there is no normal. As it relates to a value-laden system. I'm not, in this moment, I'm not referring to cultural norms or societal norms. I'm referring to that value-laden system, that it's a way to talk about a typical mode of operation. So what if my brain diverges from that typical cognitive functioning? This is an example of a neurodivergent umbrella. And again, there is no one agreed upon list or umbrella of neurodivergences. I did pull this, created this image based off of some literature. And you might be familiar with some of these neurodivergences. Some of these terms might be new to you, but let's look at how we define them. So neurodivergent is having a brain, that function and that way of operating that diverges or is different. Therefore, the way in which that individual processes information or experiences the world is different due to thinking of all of those those pathways and those highway systems and the cars that are going. And so these are natural genetic variations in brain wiring, and they can also have environmental causes, and they can affect anything from learning to mood to attention, behavior, communication, other cognitive functions. And so how might individuals, just to make sure, yes, how might individuals be neurodivergent? So this is a very simplified visual. So if we think of them as natural neurological variations, that genetic component, and there could be some neurodivergences caused by the environment. And so I'm going to give some concrete examples and to help you kind of make some connections here. So one, I have ADHD. We are actually, that was a huge response in the webinar. So we are going to unpack that and take a closer look at it in some ways with our time together today. So ADHD has a genetic component, and there could be some instances of some environmental factors. The science will get, let me backtrack, we will get there. However, so with ADHD, what we're going to look at in a minute is that there is a slight variation in some regions of the brain structure, which therefore impact the way in which those electrical signals and impulses move, and possibly some chemical signals. I also have some mental health disorders, panic, generalized anxiety, major depressive disorder, which have genetic components as well as environmental components. So it could be caused by those neurochemical signals. And an example is having a traumatic brain injury. So that was an environmental factor that influenced or impacted my brain structure, and those road, I guess you could call it as like there was the bridge collapsed or something on the neural networks. And so the way in which I process information and experience the world because of this highway system that I have is different from an individual who has a typical neurocognitive function. And so an individual can have one neurodivergence, two, multiple. So I just wanted to give some concrete examples of what that might look like. This statistic just came out last year. An estimated 15 to 20% of the world's population exhibits some form of neurodivergence. And this statistic causes a lot of interesting conversations from both ends. And what I mean by that is, so 1 in 5 people in this world have a form of neurodivergence. Is that number low? Do we know enough about neurodivergences to understand what they are, what they look like? What if you don't know that you are neurodivergent, and or access to an evaluation system, and or is that number really high? Are we over identifying? So it really causes some interesting conversations. So as we kind of close out our engagement with the terminology, I want to demystify some of the terms, and then we'll move into our next section. So is neurodivergent an exact synonym for disability? And I'll be honest, I don't have the chat open right now. So you can answer in your beautiful brain right now. So the answer is no. And why the answer is no is that if we look at the definition of disability, just taken from the dictionary, is a physical, mental, cognitive, or developmental condition that impairs with or limits an individual's ability to access or participate. And so that's really important. Disability must exist. Individuals need access to supports, to services, and also recognizing that there are some neurodivergent individuals who have either developed coping strategies, regulation strategies, masking, that has allowed that individual to overcome that barrier to access. Does not mean that it was easy, but And there are some disabilities that exist in some situations, like educationally, not in other places like the workplace. So it is very complex, but I just wanted to demystify that they are not synonyms to be used interchangeably. Are all neurodivergent students in special education? The answer is no. Like we were just talking about, some individuals may not require services or supports due to either the coping strategies, the resources that they have access to at home, and or masking. And I did mention masking before, and so I just want to give a working definition for that for us if anybody would like to know what masking is. And really, the way that it can be described is as a social survival strategy, and how it looks from one person to the next is different, but it could be forcing eye contact in conversations, mimicking gestures, hiding personal interests, developing a script to certain situations. And that can be for a variety of reasons: to feel safe, to avoid stigma, to avoid perceptions, mistreatment, feeling like that's how one needs to be successful at work or at school, and really just to try to fit in and belong, to operate closer to what is neurotypical. So I meant to do that sooner, and I apologize. So I'm so sorry. Are neurodiversity affirming approaches also equity work? And yes, these approaches provide access for all students. It's including differentiation, relationship building, access to instruction and environments, including facilities. And so we are going to continue to look at our terms. Here we have a group of neurodiverse students, and I'm going to share with you 3 different ways that you may have heard this term being used. One way, as you see here, we have both neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals. So we have a neurodiverse group. You can also say that we talked about kind of earlier, one perspective is that no matter the group of people, it is always going to be a neurodiverse group because of those different experiences and identities, that no one will ever think the same way. Therefore, the group is neurodiverse. And a third way that you might have heard the word used is through this top visual here, referring to a group of neurodivergent individuals. So I just wanted to offer that you may have heard the term used in 3 different ways. And so it is really important to understand and connect to what is the context in which this term is being used, and what is the purpose of the usage. Who are we trying to serve in this conversation? And so one student alone cannot, or one individual alone cannot be neurodiverse. And if you have used the term in this way, I don't want anyone to feel bad about it. The fact that we are having these conversations in the first place is crucial. And I do want to break down for us together why we use the term here, neurodivergent, to speak about an individual. And so I always chuckle when someone says, well, it's grammatically incorrect. I was never strong at grammar, so I can't back that up. But what it does is that when we say an individual is neurodiverse, we are really perpetuating that marginalization and that othering of that individual. Because if you ask yourself and saying, what are they neurodiverse from? It's really insinuating that there is a normal or correct way of operating, that the individual is diverse from that, when in actuality that we just unpacked that there's no one right way of operating or being, and there's neurodivergent and neurotypical. And so it's really the power of the term divergent there is divergent means moving or extending in different directions from a common point. So as human beings in our development, we start at a common point, and there are some individuals who are developing in a typical way, and there are some individuals who develop in a divergent way. Again, not better, not wrong, not right. It's just different. Also, no to neurodivergent students or neurodivergent individuals or adults. No two neurodivergent individuals are the same. Even though here we see we have two individuals with ADHD, they are never going to be the same because of those different backgrounds and experiences, that we have a continuum of experiences. But the way in which that neurodivergence manifests for one person is likely to look very different from another individual. And so it's really interesting to kind of look at how we can kind of shatter that way of thinking. And one way to think about it is the gender bias that has occurred in research thus far. It's ADHD is actually a misnomer. Being able to pay attention to lots of things at once, or one thing, hyper focusing on it is actually a strength or can be a superpower for that individual. It's really the challenges that come with regulation, the regulation of attention, the regulation of the internal environment, which also makes sense as to why we see so many co-occurrences with anxiety, especially in ADHD females. So when we think about ADHD, oftentimes in spaces when I ask, what is the first thing you think about or what is the first person or descriptors you think about when you hear ADHD? And generally, the first things that are shouted out are boys, hyper, inattentive, can't sit still. And that makes sense, because that is what we were indoctrinated really to believe. Because and a great way to explain this is Dr. Patricia Quinn actually was a guest speaker of the Parent Resource Center, and she explained this beautifully. So in the year 2000, there were 1,500 studies done on adolescents with ADHD in, I believe it was an elementary school setting. And out of those 1,500 studies, only 5 of those studies included females. So it was based off of a very homogeneous or similar group of gender and of race that therefore influenced our perceptions of what ADHD is. So a different example of that, or a real life example of that, is that I didn't learn I had ADHD until last year. I was 32 years old, and I have been in spaces my entire career supporting and advocating for many individuals, but ADHDers as one of those groups. And I came from a very privileged home with access to a lot of resources, and all of my behaviors or ways of thinking, it wasn't even like ADHD wasn't even a consideration, because we just didn't know what we didn't know. And so as we're starting to learn more and more about these different neurodivergences, we're also learning and how it looks different for each person. So what I wanted to kind of pull us together on is that idea of a label and thinking, okay, so if it looks different for everyone, how do I approach this? And so I want to talk about share about locking into a label. And so what typically tends to happen is that once, for example, these are all examples, once an individual has a label, there are often generalizations that are made about that individual. And not only are we looking at just one aspect of their identity, their thinking, their experiences, not taking advantage of all of the diverse brilliance that they are bringing with them with all of those different colorful identities. But we are only seeing them for that one. And I want to clarify that we do need labels. They are there for a reason. Research is saying that in every second, we are receiving 11 billion bits of information. Every second, 11 billion bits, that's a mouth twister, per second. Yet we only consciously process about 50 of those bits. So labels help us, our brains, to organize what we're experiencing. So labels help us as a starting point for support and access. The issues come is when we lock someone into that label and we don't interrogate what that looks like for them, how we can support them and how it manifests for them, in addition to bringing in the whole person and all of those different abilities that they bring. This is just kind of a way to reiterate the fact that when I'm sharing information about a neurodivergence or a way of operating, that it is just one of the ways that there is a continuum of human experiences, and that it might look differently for each person. So while I am talking oftentimes and sharing some information that is general, I also just want to acknowledge that there is still that continuum of experiences for everybody. So we're going to move a little bit into this aspect of ADHD. I'm going to give you a moment to read this quote from a student. And for those that benefit from auditory processing, I'm going to read it aloud. So when you see a peach, you see a piece of fruit. I see the color, the texture, and the field where it grew. Being ADHD, when I read a book about marine life, my mind allows me to travel with the fish and imagine life beneath the sea. Or I can read a book about astronomy and dance among the stars. So I want to share some information around ADHD. What's going on there? So this is a current statistic from, the CDC and the NIMH. And it's that 9.4 to 11% of US students have ADHD. And again, kind of going back to, I always question the validity of some statistics, wondering, because there's so much that we don't know about it. Also access to evaluation processes or over evaluation. So that's just kind of like a general statistic to share. And that the genetic or environmental factors of what causes ADHD specifically is unknown. But what is super interesting is that what some of the research is saying is that they are finding this one specific gene in children with ADHD. And I think one of the questions in the from the registration was, can you grow into it or grow out of it? And you can't develop ADHD. It's part of the genetic wire. It's a component of genetic wiring. And the way in which one could, I guess, theoretically grow out of it is only due to the fact that those coping strategies or those regulation strategies or medication have supported that individual where it no longer is becoming a barrier to access, but so the functioning might not be there, but it still exists. So sorry. So So why this gene is super interesting is because they're calling it the novelty-seeking gene. And that's because they're tracing it back to 10 to 40,000 years ago. And if we think about what was taking place 10 to 40,000 years ago, humans were exploring new territories, new food sources, creating new forms of social organization, or really trying to be better fit for survival to pass on those genes to survive. And so it's being looked at as an evolutionary mutation because those individuals that could go out and explore new food sources or new territories and recognize a lot or process a lot of things at once, whether they were threats or plants that they were harvesting or gathering, that was a huge advantage and benefit. And on the other side, being able to hyper focus on one task, such as setting up new organizations, was also a huge advantage. And so it's now looking at it as an evolutionary mutation, now our societies look very different. And so if you plop that individual into, and I'm just speaking very simplistically here, if we plop that individual into a, let's say, public school setting that was designed very intentionally for one way of operating and being, that might not be the most conducive environment for that individual without some environmental supports. So what I want you to focus on here, you don't have to pay attention to any of the text, just focusing on these two shapes, the orange and the blue. They represent two regions of our brain that are responsible for our executive functioning. And I know we use this term a lot. A different way to say and think about it is executing tasks. So it involves everything from planning to switching tasks to that cost benefit. Should I do this in this moment, or would it be better for me to do this in this moment? They're finding that these two regions of the brain, sizes, let me preface this by saying, sizes of brain do not equate to intelligence. Intelligence is also a whole different conversation. What they're finding is that the two regions of these regions of the brain are 3 to 5% smaller in a typically developing brain. And why that's important is that if we think about, even if it's that much, slightly smaller, if we think about those neural pathways that we talked about, all of those highways and those interstates, that traffic flow is going to be different. There's not as much space. So when we think about some of those electrical signals as those cars, there could be some traffic jams because there's not enough space, or maybe the cars aren't driving as fast. So those connections to those skills and those tasks are going to look different due to that operation. So it's not for a lack, maybe I should wait till the student example, but so just to give that example of, it's not that processing piece, how the thinking, the learning, the experiencing those cars, it's not a choice. It is how that brain is functioning. And I just wanted to put that out there. So how can we flip the script? We are kind of indoctrinated in our trainings and our schoolings in our society to look at things from a deficit perspective. We want to fix based off of our perception of what needs to be fixed. And actually, I shouldn't have even used that word, but we want to flip the script to look at what do people bring? What are their abilities? What are their superpowers? And again, there's a continuum of those experiences. I'm not saying that if you have ADHD, you have these. It is just some examples of some of those superpowers that I have found in some research. And so we often hear about individuals with ADHD who are super creative or outside of the box thinkers. And when we compare an ADHD individual to a neurotypical individual, those two, the blue and orange region of the brain, one of the functions that they are responsible for is inhibition of thought. And so in a typically developing brain, let's say right now during this webinar, I am thinking about how my coffee is actually really terrible and I cannot wait to go make something different. And that is really not helpful for me in this situation. And so a neurotypical individual might stop that. Whereas an ADHD individual, maybe they might share something about Disney World with that example. And you're thinking, how the heck did you get to Disney World? And in the ADHD brain, because there's that not as strong of a skill to inhibit that thought, it's going from my coffee is terrible to I can't wait to make a new cup. Ooh, cup. I have a Mickey Mouse cup in my cabinet at home. Man, I can't wait to go back to Florida. It is just the thought off the thought off the thought, which is why we maybe get some outside of the box thinkers and we get some of these creative thoughts that might not have occurred otherwise. There's also an aspect of oftentimes competition. When an individual is engaged in competition, it is just this level of engagement that is really incredible. And that's because they're finding that when a reward pathway is activated, there's this flood of neurotransmitters for an individual with ADHD that really is of a comforting and a positive stimulation. Also, they're finding that individuals with ADHD have really strong intuition and empathy. And that's because they're looking at heightened limbic systems and being more responsive to possibly facial expressions or really analyzing the input that they're getting due to that sensitive limbic system. And common crisis. I thought this was fascinating that many individuals who are in high stress professions like firefighters or police work or ER personnel are those with ADHD are really well suited for that because they're seeing that more theta waves are produced in those crisis situations that cause calmness and clarity. That's fascinating. And last but not least, kind of reframing the attention piece. Individuals with ADHD actually have a relative strength and superpower in maintaining attention off, maybe it's on one thing of interest or a lot of things at once. And so it's really that regulation of attention that might be difficult. But when given a task, oftentimes that individual just doesn't find it to be of interest, even though you do. So how can we kind of take that new approach, whether it is in the classroom, and understanding that it's not a blatant choice of disrespect. Often it is just, I don't see why I should be interested in this. I love this quote from a neurodivergent author. It is not how smart you are, it is how you are smart. Every single person is smart, and how we find that, how we nurture that, how we grow that, how we leverage that to support in other areas where we might not be as strong is critically important. And also bringing in that growth mindset here about the ability to make new connections with the right environments and the right supports. I also want to I don't want this information to come across as if we just adapt all environments and if we just have the right, words to say, that there'll be no more challenges. That's not the case. Challenges exist, and there is a lot of challenges that come with learning new skills and trying to perform tasks that you might not be wired to do. So I don't want to gloss over that. I want to also kind of bring that back into this space, that it is a bit of a juxtaposition here. So I do not have a green thumb, although I got my basil plant to thrive this summer, and that was really exciting. But when a plant doesn't grow, and you can put it in the chat if you like, what do you do when your seedling isn't growing? Yeah, good. Yeah, change the environment. Someone reiterated it last night. They and I've heard it before, that you can talk to your plants or sing to your plants. I did not know that. Apparently it helps. So I've got a rockin' playlist on deck to help my plants next summer. But yeah, change soil, the environment, the pot, amount of water. We never question that plant that it doesn't know how to grow. And so what I am, these are all really great examples in the chat. So when a flower doesn't bloom, we fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And so in my position in Fairfax County Public Schools, what I'm charging myself with, what I'm charging everyone around me with, is what if we treated our students and staff with that same approach? That if we provide them with the right support, environment, language, that they can flourish into the flower that they were meant to be, not what I perceive them to be. If they turn into a tulip, awesome. A rose, cool. But how can we take that same approach with our students in Fairfax County? So we're coming back to this student observation. And I'm kicking myself because I meant for this quote to be an animation, but so coming back to this, all of those emotions that we named before, the frustration, the different approaches, the define, all of those emotions that we named earlier. So what this student shared about this situation was, I honestly do not remember being asked 3 times. I'm just finally feeling so calm watching TV that I genuinely forgot. And I swear it was not 3 times, it was maybe once. And I was going to do it, but I lost track of time. And I honestly just didn't know how to switch. So I share this for a couple of reasons. One, that we often assume that behaviors are a choice. And don't get me wrong, sometimes they are, but more often than not, they are not choices. Like in this situation, this child was not trying to be disrespectful or defiant. The way in which her brain operates, having ADHD, is different. And so she was engaged in that television, which I find this part super interesting, that they're also finding that individuals with ADHD often don't have as high of a production of dopamine, of that feel-good chemical. And so when engaged in some activities like watching your favorite TV show or having your favorite food or playing a video game, that you get that hit of dopamine that you don't typically get. So it feels really good. And that's why you can hone in on that task for so long, because not only is it interesting, but you are also being flooded with feel-good chemicals. And so anything else that kind of comes in at that moment, you're really not processing it. So I just wanted to give this as an example that of just understanding a different way of operating, and to say that we will, all of those answers that you gave in the beginning, they're all correct, because we will never know what that individual is experiencing until we dig deeper, until we try to find out. And so with that, I wanted to offer us a tool. I have shared this in spaces with central office individuals, with a few principals and some teachers, and I wanted to share the same tool with you. And how I would like for us to position ourselves is based off of all of what we've just discussed, is framing this as, how can we position ourselves as the detective and not the judge? How can we ask questions, dig deeper, investigate? What is the purpose for this behavior? Is it regulation, coping, processing? If someone is using echolalia, which is the repetition of speech, what are they actually communicating? So how can we be the detectives when we're interacting with others and not the judge based off of our own perceptions of what is taking place? And so this is called a double mirror, to build capacity and understanding in a two-way approach. They mirror one another. The top section is self-reflective questions. How can we critically reflect and interrogate our own mindsets and beliefs and language or thought processes? Because our thoughts, as many of you know, our thoughts and what thoughts continue to ruminate influence and form our beliefs, influence and form our attitudes, therefore influence and form our actions, which also includes language and communication. And so these self-reflective questions you can use for yourself. So I used this example last night and put Mary Beth on the spot, and she said she was okay with it. So I'm going to do it again. I hope that's okay again. So my example was, and this could be in a work environment, in a conference room, it could be in a classroom, but as I'm sharing this information, if I was seeing Mary Beth just looking and like picking at her nails right in front of me, instead of projecting and thinking, oh my God, I would never do that, because that I don't want them to think that I'm being rude or I'm uninterested or that I don't care. I can't believe Mary Beth is doing this right now. If I ask myself, that is from my own perceptions and my own way of functioning and operating, which, side note, that's something that I would do, which is why I'm using it as an example, because I asked myself, what might Mary Beth be experiencing? What might they be communicating? What projections might I be making? And how is my response grounded in Mary Beth's support? So if I had asked myself those questions, I might come to realize that Mary Beth is maybe doing that as a way to sustain attention, that it's a way for her to engage in a task that allows her to listen to auditory information with more engagement. It could be calming her anxieties. It could be a form of self-regulation. And so those are kind of the questions that we need to flip our mindsets to consider that other experience, and how is my response grounded in Mary Beth's support? So rather than, sending Mary Beth a chat message and being like, can you stop that right now? Which might be embarrassing. Or if we were in a classroom and I would to call that out, that might not feel really good. And that's grounded in my benefit. That's not grounded in Mary Beth's benefit. So how can I reframe my response to that behavior or that way of thinking that supports Mary Beth to be successful in that environment. And these coaching questions are the exact same. They're just flipped and reframed in a way that can be used with others in a non-judgmental way, so that if you are observing or if you're experiencing or you want to help shift some mindsets in individuals around you, you can ask these questions of others. What might they be experiencing? Or what do you think they're communicating through that behavior or through that statement? And so we have these to send you. And for anyone, if anyone here is a staff member, I do have a couple versions of it as anchor charts or as a badge resource. So when I was really trying to work on these coaching questions, I cut them out and I put them in the back of my Fairfax County badge, just so that I could look down and really practice to build it into my language and my mindsets in supporting others. So we have this available for you as a tool. And so to close us out, I want to kind of summarize us with this quote. I'm going to give you a moment to read it to yourself. And for those that benefit from auditory processing, I will read it aloud. Neurodiversity alone provides a certain genius of diversity, and when it's combined and intersects with cultural diversity, gender diversity, ethnic diversity, and such, you get an even broader spectrum of wildly different human perspectives and ways of thinking, and the genius of diversity is amplified. This only happens when people are not required to assimilate in order to participate. People can participate as themselves. And so with that, I want to thank you for your time, for showing up, for being here, or if you're watching this at a later time. I sincerely appreciate you for your willingness and interest in engaging in these conversations. I wanted to offer just a few resources that I have found to be very informative and beneficial to challenge my own way of thinking with these books and these podcasts. And I'm kicking myself because I said the same thing last night and I meant to do it this morning, but I forgot to write it down. That we will be sending out, as Mary Beth mentioned in the beginning, more dates for this series as we continue to move deeper into this work and conversations. And we'll be having conversations about how to partner with your students' school at the elementary, middle school, and high school level. And I can't wait to collaborate with some of my amazing colleagues as we put together these partnerships and information. So that will be going out to you. And I just really appreciate your time. And I'm excited to hear from you.
Kristen, thanks so much. So we're starting to get some questions in the chat. And so I would like to start here with a parent who's asking, and I know that you've talked a little bit about kind of your role and perhaps what your hopes and dreams might be with regard to collaborations, but could you at least share a little bit more about how your collaboration may continue to impact what's happening here within FCPS?
For sure. I can give a couple different examples. So through collaboration with our central office teams, meeting with those teams and integrating these mindsets and approaches to current practices and what is taking place so that it's designed in what we do, not an afterthought thought or a reactive need in terms of whether that's differentiation or inclusive practices. So there's one example of collaborating with specifically meeting with those central office teams oftentimes regularly, and being a part of a member on different steering committees to influence new policies, ensuring that, again, this is integrated into what we do. And sharing perspectives. One of the most surprising and humbling and beautiful parts of my job is getting to hear about the different experiences of individuals. And when I am in spaces with groups or with people who have the influence to make direct change, I can specifically share, confidential, of course, those real life, this is what's happening and what needs to change, anything from transition work to handbooks to policy. So it's not a great answer because it's a little bit all over the place. And I think that speaks to the charge that I have and the ground that I have to cover, that it just looks different in every space and situation. So I hope I addressed part of that at least.
Kristen, thank you. I think you had mentioned last evening around a project team that
Oh,
you are putting together. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
yeah, great question, or great reminder. So it's so important for me and others that this is not just me. This is everyone's work and everyone who wants to be a part of it. And I honestly, I need support in that, because we need resources. We need school supports. We need central office supports for our operations staff, our amazing custodial staffs, our bus drivers. So I'm creating a project team that includes a variety of participants from central office, teachers, administrators, a couple parents. I'm working on getting some student input, participation, voice, and perspective, so that as a project team, we can talk about what is kind of our current state. How can we learn from one another? How can we also create an affinity group, a safe space for individuals? And how can we start creating some resources to share that are appropriate for this educational setting for adults, for students, for parents? And so that will be kicking off at the end of this month. I am selfishly ecstatic about it. And so thank you for mentioning that's definitely an approach that I'm taking to this work as a collective.
Great, Kristen, thank you. So we have a couple questions. So one parent is asking about, how do you help your child with masking in
Mm,
school because they feel uncomfortable with being neurodiverse in a school setting?
that is an incredible question. And I want to be upfront in that I'm not a parent. And I am not an expert in all neurodivergences, some, not all. And this is coming from more of a personal maybe approach, but I think there's so many things at play here that are in your control and out of your control, because I think as a safety mechanism, your child has no control over those thoughts and those the language used by others in the classroom, by their peers. And so it's not fair of me to say, they can, it makes sense to me why they want to continue to do that. And on the flip side, that's not fair. That's not fair that your child has to expend all of that energy and not showing up as their authentic self, to try to fit in or to try whatever the purpose is. So I think my hope is, on the one hand, my hope is that as we start to have more of these raw conversations with our students and with our staff, that the mindsets and the language that is being used in those spaces will start to shift so that individuals can feel safe to be their authentic selves. And I think on the flip side, it's kind of unlearning the input that we constantly receive in the day-to-day of it's changing that negative thought loop. And I'm working a lot too on like my own thought process and affirmations, and that I'm exactly who I need to be, and having that self-love and that self-confidence. And I know that's really tough. That's like such an arbitrary thing to say to you and for your student, but I think it's kind of twofold: is how do we affirm our kids to know that they are uniquely, their brain wiring is, I'm calling it wondrously wired, wondrously meaning strange and beautiful. And so I think just building up that self concept and awareness and understanding, I think, could be really powerful. But we have a lot of work to do when it comes to other spaces. Because I have adults too approaching me and saying, you know, I'm a teacher at X school, and I'm going to disclose to you, but I'm exhausted after masking all day because I don't feel safe enough in my own work environment to be my authentic self. So I tend to be afraid to offer like specific, just because I don't know. I would love to get to know your student. That's why I also kind of feel like I'm shying. I'm externally processing, as you can tell. But I kind of shy away from giving specific examples because everyone is unique, while also trying to give some generalized strategies and approaches. So I hope that was of some help.
And thank you. I just appreciate your your sincere approach to all of this, and for sharing about yourself, and because I think that just helps all of us connect
Hmm.
a little bit more. But I think this is a wonderful question, and I think it would be good to get your perspective. How do you talk to your children just about neurodiversity?
Hmm.
How do how do you and I know that this mom in particular may have some younger children, and I know that you may go through some of that when you're doing the next parts of the series, but maybe just a quick so a couple suggestions about how do you talk to your kids about neurodiversity.
Yeah, that's such a good question. Well, the good news is that I'm working on a resource for that, for different age groups. But I think what I would recommend is asking lots of questions to understand their thought process and approach, because I've I've since learned, coming out of the classroom, that I used to do a lot of the thinking in the classroom, and the thinking, the communicating should really be coming from those that I am serving to um, enhance their learning or understanding. And so I think I would just start asking some general questions about, why, tell me about something that happened in class today with, one of your classmates or a group of your classmates. And why do you think that they did it this way? And why that makes sense? Because they are uniquely them. And we need their different approach to complete that task that you just mentioned. And I think just almost as if having a coaching conversation with your child could be extremely beneficial just to have them engage in that thinking and recognition of other ways of operating as being just that, different ways of approaching that are no more correct or wrong than what they are doing. And again, a caveat to that is I'm not, in this situation, I'm not including, unsafe behaviors or practices, just kind of in a typical occurring classroom environment, just to have those conversations and affirming just what their approach is correct and no more correct or wrong than yours, and think of all the different ways. Why do you think that they came to that approach? And now I'm just rambling, so I'm gonna end it there.
Okay, Kristen, thank you. And we've had some really some great conversations kind of in the chat, family sharing with each other, which I think is wonderful, and
Yeah.
you'll be able to get to see that. And I think it's, I know we're 15 minutes over our time. I know we started about 15 minutes late, so I want to make sure that I honor everyone's time as well. But I do want to remind everyone who's still on the webinar with us that we have so many resources here at the Parent Resource Center. If you would like to talk with one of us and have a consultation to talk more specifically about your child, questions you may have, please do let us know, and we would be happy to speak with you. Shoot us an email, give us a call. And we are working in tandem with Kristen, and we want to make sure that we're using up-to-date resources, and we're sharing those with you all, and so we really do have a prolific kind of conversation back and forth. So please do reach out to us. And I know someone just put a question in the chat about required training for teachers. And I know that, Kristen, that's something that, the school system is working on. I think a part of what we're doing today is, as we're recording these webinars that Kristen is doing, these are going to be available for staff, for families, for students, even to be able to continue to have some conversations. And I know that, Kristen, and I'll let you speak to this, I know that you're working on how are we going to support better understandings and how we work with students who are neurodiverse. Is that correct?
Yes. Lots more to come through some different platforms. Just trying to look at some different approaches to meet everyone's needs, but also the ways in which they can access it. And I was also just kind of processing still some of those questions, and just kind of wanted to put back out there for any students, age or children's age, to just kind of go back to that framing of being the detective and not the judge, and just asking those why questions, and to get to understand another human being better. So be the detective and not the judge.
Kristen, thank you. I think that's a great way to end. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Please do reach out if you have any other questions or need some other resources. And we hope that everyone has a wonderful weekend. Please do take care, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.